But the resurrection is a different kind of power. It is an unimaginable kind of power. To put it in the simplest terms, what Christianity offers is the restoration of the past that we've messed up. That's called the forgiveness of sins. And it's the gift of the future in which all we can see ahead is death through eternal life. So the resurrection, and I describe the restoration of Peter in this light in the 5th chapter, the resurrection includes those two kinds of power to forgive and the power, in other words, the power for our mistakes not to define, and our human limitations not to define us, and then even greater, the power for death not to define us.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. As you probably saw when you clicked through or added this to your queue, today's guest is Samuel Wells, and he is back to discuss his book, Power and Passion, 6 Characters in Search of Resurrection. And I know I try to avoid that because we do talk about it in the body of the interview, but I would highly recommend, as this episode is being released late in 2025, keep this book in mind as a possible book that you might read during Lent, if that's a thing that you do, because that is what this book was written for. As is often the case on this podcast, we didn't spend a ton of time digging into the book too much. I mostly just indulged whatever whims crossed my mind as he said things that made me think of other things. That notwithstanding, this is a really good book. I enjoyed this book 16 years ago when I read it, and I enjoyed having it back to reacquaint myself with it. So, I won't belabor this introduction anymore, except to say that if you're listening for free, thank you. Thank you for listening. Please make sure you're subscribing, following, whatever your platform calls it. Toss me a review or a rating. Again, whatever your platform refers to giving some kind of quantitative or qualitative feedback. I would love that. And so follow me out there on the social medias, the Instagrams, the TikToks, and whatnot. I put promotional videos out there, so when I do an interview, you will know to expect what is coming. But you can also throw feedback my way to let me know what you would like to hear, subjects, authors, that kind of thing. You can also let me know how you think I'm doing. Whether you believe it or not, that is something that's very important to me. Also, you have the option of supporting the podcast financially. So for $5 a month, you'll get episodes early. Right now, it's about 10 days, but starting in January 2026, it'll actually be even sooner. Every Monday, an episode comes out, and then the Friday of the following week, it'll be out for free. Right now, it's Wednesdays of the following week, but starting 2026, it'll be Monday for $5, and then the following week's Friday for free. So I appreciate the support no matter which you decide. It means a lot to me to see that my downloads go up rather than, stay flat or even worse, drop. So, okay. Well, I hope you enjoy my conversation with Samuel Wells. I will be back at the end of the episode to introduce a preview of next week's episode. Samuel Wells, welcome back.
Great to be back.
You are one of 3 now. I've only had, no, that's not true. I guess it's 4 return guests. Yeah, so the podcast has been around long enough for me to start revisiting people. Diving right in, because you've already introduced yourself, so I would encourage listeners to go back and listen to the first conversation about your wonderful book, Improvisation. But today we're going to be discussing your, I believe, 2007 book, Power and Passion, 6 Characters in Search of Resurrection. So what is there anything about the story of how you came to write this book that you want to talk about before we get going?
I guess something that may be of interest is when I was approached about leaving Cambridge, UK, and becoming Dean of Duke University Chapel, I had a conversation with the then Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, and said, you're one of the few people who would understand why I might want to do this. Is there anything I should know from you? I suppose I was asking for his blessing, really, before I say yes to doing this. And he said, well, you could do me a favor. You could write the Lent book for next year, because the Archbishop always has a Lent book. And so I did, and I ended up writing it during the transition from Cambridge to Duke, which meant I wrote it probably faster than certainly any book I'd written to that point, and with possibly one exception, any book I've ever done. So, but in a sense, to write a book about political engagement and personal faith while transitioning between Europe and the United States wasn't such a bad thing to be doing.
And so as you said, Rowan Williams, and I want to read something from the foreword that he wrote for this book. So ordinarily, I try not to make a habit of reading my guests' books to them. But in the foreword, he writes, "Passion is something we think of chiefly in terms of personal intensity. Politics is about managing things and calculating possibilities, and so, as often as not, compromising that intensity. But what if they do belong together in a way that makes passion more than a recipe for mere gestures and politics more than a round of rather shabby horse trading?" And then jumping over to your introduction, when you get to, this is where I want to kick the conversation off in earnest. So when you talk about what this book assumes, you say, "I assume that the Gospels were intended to be pondered word by word, action by action, scene by scene, by communities seeking to embody their faith in Jesus in practical acts of discipleship in the world." And then you go on to discuss Lectio Divina. So I think as a way of approaching, when we get to the main, we'll say, cast of characters in this book, can you describe what Lectio Divina is as a methodology?
Yeah, it's a way of praying through the scriptures, often in a group. So most commonly, it's what we do every Wednesday night here at St. Martin the Fields. We have a Eucharist, which lasts about an hour, and then we have small groups that last about 45 minutes, and they do Lectio together, so in groups of about a dozen or 15, and we also do these online now, so people join from all over the world. You read a scripture passage. It's usually the same scripture passage that's been preached on at the service earlier, in our case. And then everyone in the room is invited to highlight a phrase, sometimes a single word, that stood out for them as they heard the passage. And then you listen to what people have heard, and then somebody reads the passage a second time, and they either talk about what somebody else has mentioned as their phrase, or they talk a little bit about the phrase they've chosen, or they choose a different phrase and reflect on that. And then often you finish by reading the passage a third time. And I guess I did have a penny drop moment, and I talk about it, I think, in the introduction to the book. And this was in 2004, I think, or 2005, as I was beginning to, because I wrote the book in the last 4 months of 2005, and of course it took a year to go into production. So it was probably early 2005 when I had this penny drop moment that I realized that this was how the Gospels were written. People said things, or people said to each other in a small worshipping Christian community, fledgling, they would say there was this time when Jesus came to a town, and he talked to this woman by a well, and she was quite a notorious woman. She'd had a number of partners in the past, and the person she was with wasn't her husband. And he talked to her in a particular kind of way, and I imagine somebody said, yes, yes. What he said was this. He said, I will give you living water. And people said, well, I'm not sure it was quite living water, but he also said, I think he was talking about those cisterns and the dank cisterns in Jeremiah. And I think when we tell the story, we need to reflect the fact that he was really contrasting the cisterns with the living water. And there was something about a bucket, wasn't there? And this is how the stories came to be written. We tend to think of John, the writer of the fourth gospel, sort of sharpening his pen and saying, okay, I've got some notes of Jesus' life like a journalist, and I'm now going to write them up. But I think that the notion that was a Johannine community, as to use a technical term, and that they wrote the stories together and they refined them, and they, I was very affected by John Bell, the hymn writer. I remember hearing him say that he doesn't publish a hymn until they've sung it in the Iona community for 3 years. So I can imagine that the Gospels were written by communities who sort of held, like a coffee grower, who sort of smelt the stories in their hands. And they didn't dash it off to the printers straight away, like a journalist with copy for tomorrow's newspaper. And they didn't stick it straight in their blog with the right to change the words later if they so saw fit. They let these stories percolate in their imaginations for perhaps several years before they wrote them into the manuscript that we now know as John's Gospel or Mark's Gospel. And so all of which is saying that idea of, I'm sure that wasn't there in the original story, that's not what John intended, the fact that he says 153 fish, it's probably a complete imposition to say that refers to all the nations of the Gentiles. And when Jesus says fish on the other side of the boat, he's, the idea that he's making some sort of sly reference to fishing amongst the nations rather than fishing always just about the Jews. That's over reading it. I bet there was just 153 fish and that was the way it was. I came to realize that was such a inadequate way of reading the Gospels, that actually all of the numbers there mean something. All of the kind of references to clothing or whatever, they're all there for a reason. Then there's no casual statements in the Gospels. And so to read the stories in the way that I read them in that book is not just sort of imaginative and unusual. It's exactly what was in the minds and the spirit of the people who wrote the Gospel and the communities that cherished those Gospels in the first place.
I'll try not to drive us too far into digression, but I think learning more about, scribal practice and, seeing this difference in this extant copy and that difference in that one and the, redactional layers and all of that stuff. But then also, a Syriac text might contain marginal notes that indicate it was being prepped for liturgical use. It's driven me away from what I think is a cynicism that exists when a lot of people approach biblical texts, particularly in the West, where they do try to undermine and undercut it, and also the people who only try to say like, nope, it's just true, and you have to find a way for it to be true in this narrow framework.
Yeah,
and it is a negotiation not only with a text, but with your peers, those around you, and then your forebears, and even with those, your successors, those who are coming after you.
Yeah,
and that's a pretty interesting challenge. This may be one of the few areas in contemporary Western life where we still have that. I think we've winnowed a lot of other things away. So, yeah. Sorry. Like I said, I'll try not to take us too far. How did you? So this is for Lenten reflection, right?
So there's a great tradition, certainly in the churches in England, of Lent being a time for scripture study. It's a time for fasting. It's a time for penitence, almsgiving, and so on. It's a taking stock time. But there's a long-standing tradition that people will take on a project and read a book together, and that's often ecumenical. It's often the only ecumenical thing that happens in a community, in a neighborhood or a town during the year, and it's a great tradition. And so the Archbishop's Lent book will always sell 10,000 plus copies, because people will, obviously not everybody chooses the Archbishop's book, but we're going back 20 years now when that was more common. People would just buy the book whether they'd read it before or not, and they'd take the Archbishop's word for it, as it were.
So I guess I'm wondering, like, how did you decide to structure the book the way that it is structured? So you're writing it for Lent. How did you
Yes, and
go from
I
there?
remember having a lunch in Cambridge with the publisher, and I remember we didn't agree straight away about the book, and I can't honestly remember what we disagreed about, but we explored a number of different things that would work for me, would work for her, and it was, it was pretty intense to and fro, and explored 4 or 5 different ways to go about this. I guess because it's trying to do a number of things. I was wanting to say something, at that stage, I my writing was mostly in the area of Christian ethics, and so I was interested in how people live faithful lives as Christians. So that's the basic pretext of the book. But I was also interested in, as I've just been describing, shaping people's imaginations about how they read the Bible in a more exciting way, and for all it's worth, as is sometimes put. And I was also interested particularly in how people don't treat Christianity as simply a pious devotional exercise for themselves, but make a significant political difference, both individually and corporately. So putting all of those things together, I thought a particularly interesting way to do it would be to take 6 of the characters that feature in the Passiontide story and see the story from their point of view, to take 2 or 3 episodes in most cases. Obviously, 1 or 2 of the chapters are different, but to take a couple of episodes and work through those exegetically, and then certainly in the last section of each chapter to do a reflection on what their context choices mean for Christian discipleship and ministry and mission today, particularly in the face of the temptations and challenges that we face in the modern world. So I'm glad that you've invited me onto this podcast to talk about it, because it is a book I wrote 20 years ago, and for various rather complicated copyright reasons, it's one of the books I wrote in that period that hasn't ever gone into a second edition. So it's a little bit difficult to get hold of. So I'm glad that we're talking about it, because the improvisation that we talked about a while ago together has gone into a second edition, and 1 or 2 of my other books from that period have gone into a second edition, but Power and Passion hasn't. And it's actually sold possibly more than any of my other books. I've never really checked, but it hasn't. But there's been a slight mix-up over the who holds the rights to it.
Maybe this will be the thing that clears up that logjam.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad so when I read it in 2009, and I really liked it. And I believe my son and I were on a trip to Virginia to visit family, and I liked it so much I gave it to my dad, and then never thought until, and I may or may not disclose why I reached out to you to talk about this book, but after you agreed, I ordered another copy. and I'm glad I could get it. I think it's available electronically too. I don't remember,
Okay.
but I'll definitely have a link to however people can get a hold of it. But the as I said earlier, the cast of characters. So I do want to make sure we get a chance to address the the individuals that you go through. So the list is Pontius Pilate, Barabbas, Joseph of Arimathea, Mrs. Pilate, Peter, and Mary Magdalene. I do appreciate that you call her Mrs. Pilate. I thought about that a little bit. You don't have to talk about that if you don't want to. I just thought that that was a fun little detail.
Well, it's funny. That was the chapter I most enjoyed writing, and that's the chapter that the scholars community were most skeptical about because they thought I was taking a bit of a risk. Because, as people are probably aware, there's only one verse in the New Testament that refers to Mrs. Pilate, that calls her Pilate's wife. But I thought she needed a name of her own and not just something that defined her entirely by her marriage. But the more I got into it, that is structured slightly differently because, as I say, with someone like Mary Magdalene or Peter, you've got two or three stories from the scriptures that where you can compare and contrast their activities, and obviously they both play a very significant role in the Passion. But with Mrs. Pilate, there is just the one verse. But I guess it's classic Lectio in the sense that I let that verse fill a whole chapter, and rather than take the approach I do elsewhere of looking at a couple of scriptural passages about each character, in this case, I make up four possible identities for Mrs. Pilate and imagine what their lives were like and what led them to plead for Christ's mercy, have nothing to do with this innocent man, from the somewhat cynical through to the secret disciple and a couple of spots in between. And in doing that, I guess I did have a bit of a intuition about my imagined reader, because when I'd led Lent courses before, I had often had women of a certain age whose lives had often been defined by their husband's career, and whose roles in life had often been significantly shaped by raising children. And I wanted to write a chapter that spoke specifically to their situation. Obviously, they weren't themselves married to an occupying governor and about to put to death a person who would still be the center of the world's attention 2,000 years later. I wasn't assuming that, but I was assuming I wanted to write a chapter that was very relatable for people and would really get a conversation going and allow people to reflect on some things that aren't talked about together and certainly aren't often talked about in a mature way in the church, which is what is a good way for a woman to live out her discipleship and to play a political public role when her husband's career so dominates the household and where she may be expected to live her life in a very secluded sphere. So I enjoyed writing that chapter, and I obviously ran my drafts past people who were in those kind of situations in life themselves, and nuanced my accounts helpfully.
So the title is Power and Passion. And so those two things are represented or reflected in each of these characters. Do you want to start at the beginning with Pontius Pilate, or do you want to start with the chapter that about Mrs. Pilate? And I'll leave it up to you. You can pick it up wherever you want. What do you think the best representation of what you're talking about with regard to power and passion is?
Well, I think that it's funny, from having written it 20 years ago, and it's been a while since I've looked through it in detail, but in some ways the scene that I think is perhaps the most telling in the whole book is the one where I talk about Nicodemus as a disciple by night. And I kind of work out, and I think there was a couple of commentaries that helped me get to this, but I kind of work out that he might well have been at the Sanhedrin, or Joseph of Arimathea, even more so. One of them might well have been at the Sanhedrin that voted to hand Jesus over to Pilate and schemed to have him disposed of. And yet, taking significant risk, Joseph of Arimathea provides the tomb, and Nicodemus provides the spices. I think before I wrote this book, I hadn't ever noticed that passage where Nicodemus reappears in John's Gospel. I'd associate him entirely with John 3, the born again passage, and had never really noticed that he reappears at the end of the story, which just shows, I guess how liturgically shaped my imagination was, and how if it doesn't come up in the lectionary, I hadn't paid close attention to it. Anyhow, so I worked out that their personal passion, particularly Nicodemus coming to Jesus by night in John chapter 3, and their political commitments were in perhaps profoundly different places. And so I really explore whether it's possible to be a faithful Christian and what the tensions are in being a faithful Christian when you're in that situation where your power and your passion are pulled apart. And I think I was inspired by this by a book by a Benedictine called Thomas Cullinan called The Passion of Political Love, which I'd read just before I went to seminary in the late 80s. I think that's partly where I got the idea of the name of the book from. And understanding, I guess, the two meanings of passion being the sense that you feel strongly and engages your feelings, and passion in the sense of the technical term for the last hours of Jesus's life. But also, having just written that book, Improvisation, that you and I talked about before, and developed a much more nuanced idea of power, and how power isn't simply authority to execute your will, often through the agency of employees or people you rule over or something like that. But power can be found in quite a number of different forms. And in the book, I'm trying to explore the realities of how power works, how sexual power can work in the case, for example, of Mary Magdalene, how manipulation can work in the hands of somebody who understands how to get under somebody's skin, and those kind of things. So I guess one of the things I'm happiest about the book is that the book does come to a crescendo, so that at the end of the last chapter, you do get a kind of resolution through cross and on to resurrection of how these apparently contrasting, intense relationship notions of power and passion finally are resolved. It also reminds me of something I've actually forgotten about, but only remembered when you read the subtitle of the book, because I think of the book as Power and Passion, and I've forgotten about the subtitle. That people may know the Romanian playwright Pirandello, who wrote a book called Six Characters in Search of an Author. Sorry, it's a play. Wrote a play called Six. That's where I got the idea for the subtitle. But the subtitle was a second choice. The third P in the original title was politics, but the particular publisher, who's you'll have probably gathered I've had my moments with, said we don't publish books with the word politics in the title. So that was a bit of an insuperable issue from a marketing point of view. So I created this alternative subtitle. But you can see, I think you can see, and I haven't looked at this for quite a while, but I think you can see in the last chapter that the way I talk about power, passion, and politics is assuming a subtitle that no longer exists. And as a kind of act of protest, I didn't change that section. But even though was prepared to change the subtitle, my principle with publishers is that I will usually lie down in the road to have my title, but will be flexible about the subtitle. And on this occasion, that was kind of how it worked.
So I do wonder. Okay, reading that list of names, I think anyone who knows anything about the biblical narrative would say Pontius Pilate is very obviously the most powerful person in terms of particularly politics. Is there a misalignment, I guess, between one's power and one's passion? Like, who is the most passionate in this list? And where would you put them with regard to the power that they hold? Because you do say everyone has power and passion.
Yeah. So I think that the historiography, to use the technical term, of Pontius Pilate is really interesting. And I did find a book that was more or less about that, which was one of the books that started me off in writing this book. And I think that was the first chapter I wrote. I've written a lot of books, but I haven't written many from page 1 to the last page. But I think this is one of the very few that I did write like that. And it's definitely more satisfying to write a book that way. But so one of the things that started me was, why does it suit us? And of course, there's always a question of who do you mean by us? But why does it suit us to think of Pontius Pilate as basically impartial? He certainly tries to present himself like that. He washes his hands, most obviously. He basically says, I haven't got a dog in this fight. But clearly centuries of anti-Semitism have encouraged Christians to portray Jesus' crucifixion as the fault of the Jewish authorities at the time, and the high priest who, talks about better that one person die than the whole country, which is clearly a profoundly coded message. And then, of course, the crowd in the Praetorium saying, his blood be on us and our children, which has had such a devastating effect on Christian-Jewish relations for many, many centuries. There is a politics around what is said about Pontius Pilate. And I wanted to get inside that politics and then imagine what his passion really might be. Because if you look at the history, and I do a little bit of this in the chapter, I'm not usually one for doing a lot of historical criticism, but, he clearly didn't have a great record in terms of being nice to people as governor. And so the idea that he was simply impartial and he didn't have his own stake in Jesus's fate is a particular point of view, but it's probably a rather implausible point of view. However, and this of course comes out in the Mrs. Pilate chapter, he's not as powerful as he seems. And I do a little bit of political analysis in the Pontius Pilate chapter to understand how Roman government worked. And in some ways, it worked pretty much like British rule in India in the 19th century, in the sense that they just didn't have enough troops to dominate the country. They had to set up little client states. So that's where people like Herod came in. I don't think I used this phrase in the book because I was worried that it might be taken as anti-Semitic. But casually in a conversation like this, I think I could use a phrase like, why keep dogs and bark yourself? I mean, that's pretty much the Roman approach to ruling. They're not just in Palestine, but all across the Mediterranean, they found client kings and so on, which meant who were happy as quislings to do pretty much what suited the Romans and to save the Romans, just like the British in India, from bringing on enormous numbers of troops, which would have crippled the empire. So there's all sorts of different kinds of power and different kinds of weakness and vulnerability. And then obviously the stuff about Pilate's passion is, is speculation. We're not given that in the in the Bible, but we do have that line about Pilate mixing the blood of the Galileans with their sacrifices. So we got a sense of his ruthlessness there. And I guess what I'm steering towards, and on a personal level, I think this has got a personal dimension for me, is that I have flourished in ministry and in life to the extent that I have managed to integrate my passions into my ministry and professional life. Hence this conversation. I love to write books, and I have managed to find a way to make that part of my ministry. And I know plenty of people who haven't managed to do that. They haven't managed to marry together their passion and their power. And that can be on a psychological level about how they exercise their power or how perhaps inappropriately they exercise their passion. But it can be more in the way that I'm describing. They just have amazing hobbies, but it wouldn't occur to them for those hobbies to surface professionally. So there's a lot going on there. And Pontius Pilate, I think, is a good place to start.
I don't know if you're familiar with these, but the Charles Bronson Death Wish movies are coming to mind with regard to the idea of someone who is passionate and also powerful, but it's almost like their understanding of their power is that it is diminished. And I'm looking at that as like a thing that has driven particularly American culture in the, 50 years since those movies started coming out. But also, just for the listeners' sake, because they don't know when we record this, it's 20 June. We are globally on a razor's edge. People are throwing around the term World War III, which is not, by the way, what drove me to reach out to you to talk about this. But there's a real question of like, are we about to see an all-out war in Southwest Asia? And I bring that up because the mass of people in the West seem to be very passionate about this one way or the other. Largely, seemingly, I think most people are against a World War III, but there's also a severe lack of accountability. I don't know about in the UK, but in the US, on the part of individual citizens who are themselves very powerful and have used their power for decades, going back to the Death Wish thing, seeing the world as a dangerous place and co-signing violent action that has only led to where we are now. And they see themselves as not powerful. And that almost drives how passionate they are. I understand that is a very circuitous line of thinking. Do you have any thoughts on that? Do you feel like that is that relevant? Am I on topic?
Well, I guess the observation I'd have about some of the people you're talking about is whether the pursuit of power is an end in itself, and whether when some of these people actually have power, that's to say, power understood as meaning capability to make visible and tangible change in the lives of large numbers of people, whether they actually really know what to do with that power. There is clearly for the current American president, there's a profound story of dispossession going on. It seems to me he came to power on a story of dispossession. You have been done over. You've been done over by big business. You've been done over by wokeness and DEI. You've been done over by foreign competition. Your inheritance has been taken away. Your kids can't afford to buy a house. Nobody's job is secure anymore. There are all these immigrants around, and they make your life. They seem to be doing okay, and your life has stayed still. These kinds of stories are dominant, and so he offered himself to the American people as a person that understood their sense of dispossession and offered to fix it. I don't see any sign that he's fixed it, but he continues to identify with the story of dispossession. It's almost like if he did fix it, he would lose his appeal, because dispossession is his appeal. So there's a strong emphasis of individuals seeking and gaining power. It's often a power based on a sort of sense of resentment. But there is much less of a sense, in my view, that people, even if they feel, I mean, to gain power and then to indulge your passion, and we've seen some interesting celebration rituals, shall we say, from individuals who've been part of gaining power in recent months. But actually, to know what you do with that power once you've gained it, I don't think we have seen many examples of that. So there's a kind of sadness about those who've gained power, because, okay, I guess there's for those who are insecure and those of a small ego, there's a certain flattery about everybody looking at you and talking about you all the time. But what do you actually want to do with that? I don't see that those who have gained power in that way have, I mean, obviously you can line your own pocket and so on, but most of the people we're talking about are going from mega wealthy to even more mega wealthy. So there's a pointlessness about that as well. I'm just not seeing that people have got a sense of what they want to do with their power. And so in that sense, they don't gain my respect as much as some much more humble individuals who have a very good sense of what to do with their power, know that it's limited, and know that it sometimes has consequences and isn't going to make everybody happy, but also know how to limit the damage that they can do.
There's almost a kind of acceptance of that. And I've heard this in, there's a podcast series called Nice Try about attempts at utopia. And I know for like the last century, we haven't really had many utopian idealists that rise up without immediately being mocked. But I'm thinking of 1984, where when you really get down to it, O'Brien and all of the rest of the inner party, they are aware that they are just maintaining power to maintain power. And it's disgusting, but there's no attempt to escape the fact that we're committing acts of violence to continue committing acts of violence that will lead to further violence. And that's where dystopian literature, I think, has captivated people's imaginations. Mm-hmm. So when you look at whether it's the Romans or whatever local collaborators there were throughout the Roman Empire who were also participating in a system of violence, the utter cruelty of crucifixion seems like the apex of power. But when it's juxtaposed to what happens in the crucifixion of Jesus, it is actually power's nadir. And power's apex or zenith is in resurrection. And that's what ultimately I am trying to wrap my brain around how are these six characters all in search of resurrection, but it's almost as though the narrative, the historical, the grand narrative is compelled toward resurrection, right?
Well, I guess in a sense, by introducing resurrection, obviously it's a Lent book, so in the last week you're going to be starting to think about resurrection, and hence Mary Magdalene's experience in the garden coming at the very end of the book. But the basic point about resurrection is, as you've said, crucifixion is the public demonstration that I can completely squash you if I choose to do so. And it isn't the Jewish authorities that completely squash Jews. It is absolutely pure and simple the Romans. It was a Roman method of execution, and it was a way of publicly humiliating those whom it executed, not least as a powerful example to anybody who might remotely think of doing any such thing themselves. It's easy for Christians to forget that the cross wasn't invented for Jesus. It was an established form of execution to make an example of people and to act as a deterrent. And, it would certainly deter me. It was pretty scary and a horrible way to die and almost unimaginable pain, and so on. But so that's a demonstration of a certain kind of power. And, if you've got a very elaborate atonement theory or something, you can miss the sheer physicality and power dynamic of the cross. You're naked, you can't use your arms to scratch your forehead. It's humiliating and distressing on every level. But the resurrection is a different kind of power. It is an unimaginable kind of power. To put it in the simplest terms, what Christianity offers is the restoration of the past that we've messed up. That's called the forgiveness of sins. And it's the gift of the future in which all we can see ahead is death through eternal life. So the resurrection, and I describe the restoration of Peter in this light in the 5th chapter, the resurrection includes those two kinds of power, the power to forgive and the power, in other words, the power for our mistakes not to define, and our human limitations not to define us, and then even greater, the power for death not to define us. And basically, that's really what baptism is all about. It's basically all about saying, once you have taken off the table the threat of death, nothing can touch you. You're the most powerful person in the world. So it's a complete transformation of power. And I suppose that the significance of the word passion is, I guess, a kind of almost a postscript to the book. And it was inspired by Kevin Van Hooser, who was my teacher when I was a seminarian, who came and preached at the church where I was first ordained. And I remember him asking this question in his Good Friday address. We are God's passion. Is he ours? And again, that had the sort of moral effect of what I've just said about resurrection. It completely changes the word passion from something somewhat private that we may or may not be proud of, but nonetheless wear on our sleeve, to something that's fundamentally divine and explains the whole dynamic of the universe, of God creating the world to be with us in Christ. So, so resurrection is really about transforming our whole notion of power, and that's why it occupies a central place in the last chapter of the book.
So a while back, I think it was in March, so like a year after I talked to you about improvisation, I talked to Andrew Rillera, and I didn't think about the Duke connection, and I'm not sure if you know him, but he did his PhD at Duke, and we were talking about his book, Lamb of the Free, and kind of the ethical implications of some of the things that he's, and I'm not sure if you've read the book, but if you haven't, I saw a lot of connection between that, how he's describing sacrifice and suffering not necessarily being a part of sacrifice, and that just this whole bundle of things that's so complex but so beautiful. I compared it to kind of the ethical assertions that you make in improvisation, and he lit up. And again, I wasn't thinking about the Duke connection, but another Duke person who actually was the first person to recommend Relayer to me was Curtis Freeman. And so all of you guys together have done a really good job for in my brain of helping me associate the physicality, the materiality of the incarnation and the importance there, and not so much the abstract notion of suffering necessarily. And that really does help it focus on the power part of something like resurrection. And it, I mean, it's a whole ball of wax, but my personal perspective on love, my answer to Van Hooser would be, well, no, God probably isn't our passion. And I understand that's not the answer that many Christians want to hear. But the idea of a perfect love coming our way being something that we're not fully able to comprehend, but it remaking all of creation and all of reality being so obviously important in the way that, like in the horror movie, the thing that's coming, you've got to warn everybody. Well, this is the exact inverse of that, where something so good is happening that should be the focus of your attention. And again, I know that was a long walk to get there, but I really do feel like when you're talking about passion and power, the discipline of continually recognizing that through not just the crucifixion, which in my American evangelical upbringing was the kind of the center point, but the resurrection and renewal that does not need your participation to be true, to be meaningful, to be significant, to be powerful. Yeah, if you can make sense of my rambling, I would appreciate that.
Well, I think we're coming towards the end, aren't we? But I guess I wanted to go back to where I started, to move away from the Passion story being fundamentally about Jesus dying for my sins in that conventional configuration, and to see it as the vortex that encapsulates so much beyond that. Power and passion were the two most significant words. We haven't talked a lot about politics, as it's turned out, but I was, the phrase "the personal is the political" is significantly at the back of this book. I really wanted to keep the balance between personal and political, and I wanted to partly to do that by talking about the politics of Jesus himself, and how many of his gestures, most obviously cleansing the temple, coming into Jerusalem on a donkey, these kind of things were political statements as well as being, the actions of the Messiah, if you like. And so it's not telling people they shouldn't be devoted disciples, they should get involved with politics. It's not saying that. It's awakening people to the political dimension of their ordinary activities, but also the political choices they're making. For it's most obviously, again, back where we started, by wanting to be a disciple by night, but also recognizing fundamentally that the most powerful force in the universe, beyond any conventional notion of politics, is God's passion for us.
So where I would normally ask for book recommendations and things like that, I guess, and I'll throw out an example. So I would say World Central Kitchen. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but Chef Jose Andres has a charity nonprofit NGO that, whether it's a natural disaster or a war zone, he sends people in to cook real food for people who are suffering. Yeah, it's a truly beautiful thing. So are there ways that people can engage, like World Central Kitchen, that they can devote their time or their resources that you can think of to show love, which may be the best answer to how do you use your passion and your power?
Well, I always say to say I am your friend is to say I am allowing myself to be changed by knowing you. And as you say, we're speaking in June 2025, and my query to our viewers and listeners would be, do you have a Palestinian amongst your friends? Do you have a Muslim amongst your friends? Do you have a Jew amongst your friends? Do you have an Israeli amongst your friends? Because if you don't, how are you allowing yourself to be changed through friendship and gain a true, powerful, political, and passionate understanding of the crisis in Gaza that's going on right now? I know that sounds a little bit soft for a lot of people because people want to feel they're marching on Washington or something like that, or denouncing some gross abrogation of human rights or something like that. You can do that if you want to. But to me, the investment, I mean, obviously I write a lot about being with, the investment of time and care and allowing yourself to love somebody who comes from a position that might be challenging to you is the transformation that God calls us to, and is the reason why Jesus surrounded himself with disciples who came from somewhat dubious backgrounds. He was allowing himself to be changed by knowing them as they were by knowing him. So that would be my challenge.
That's a very, I think, ground level response. So I appreciate that. Yeah, look, listeners, you're gonna hear it again in my little outro. But if you get a chance to love somebody, you should take it. That's kind of been the thing, the motto that I've developed for the podcast. And I'll tell you right now, I'm gonna go ahead. Normally, I just take the title of the book or the article or whatever, and that's the name of it. The name of this episode is going to be Power, Passion, and Politics. Even though we didn't speak explicitly about politics too much, we did. And in a way that I think can be evergreen beyond when this comes out. Maybe there won't be a crisis in Gaza anymore. Maybe there will not have been a war between Israel and Iran. Maybe it will be something different, but you will still need to take the opportunity to love people when you see them. So, Samuel Wells, I appreciate so much you sitting down with me to talk about this lovely book, and I hope the publisher sees a spike in sales and they get a lawyer on sorting out the problems. Do you have anything else for us before we go?
No, just I hope this is a blessing to others, and all good wishes for your future podcasts.
Thank you so much. Take care. Okay, here we are. The episode is over. So all that's left to do is to hear a preview of what's coming next week. But first, I do want to go into, at least just broadly, what the motivation for this episode was. I was kind of on the fence about that. But, right now, in this moment, recording this, I've decided to go ahead and say, I wasn't sure what it reminded me of when I initially saw the meeting between the president of El Salvador and the president of the United States in the Oval Office. And they were discussing the specific case of a man named Kilmar Abrego Garcia. And a journalist asked the president of the United States if he was going to bring Mr. Abrego Garcia back to the United States. And the president said, well, how, I can't do that. I'm paraphrasing. It said that he couldn't do that, that he fell under the president of El Salvador's jurisdiction now. And then the president of El Salvador basically said, how can I do that? This man's a terrorist. How can I release him from prison? And then I heard Ezra Klein on his podcast, which I'll link to the episode so you can hear it, just describe that interaction. And it clicked in my head what that reminded me of. And it reminded me of this book, which is when immediately, I don't like to send emails for the podcast from my phone because it has that little from my iPhone signature. And I feel like that it's a better look if I send it from my computer. So as soon as I got home that day, I sent Samuel Wells an email asking him if he would be interested in coming back on to discuss that. Because what we had there was two individuals who had all the power in the world to do something about this thing. And they were denying that they did. And that was my motivation. I saw that and I thought, people denying that they have the power that they have, which is a subject that comes up in this book. And a thing that I brought up is voters. In this conversation that you just heard, I brought up voters. A conversation that I have a lot with people is around the topic of term limits. And think what you want about term limits. That's fine. Have your opinion. A thing that I note I'll say all of them because it probably is literally all of those conversations. And I check this every once in a while. I'll ask them, what is the only thing more popular, statistically speaking, than term limits, which poll at around 80% of public support, bipartisan support in favor of term limits. And the thing in the United States of America that is more popular, there are probably others, but the thing that I point to that's relevant is reelecting incumbents. And I've had conversations with people who are advocating term limits, and I've asked, did you vote for the incumbent in a primary? And for those of you who may be listening who don't understand, most states have a primary to choose who the nominee for the respective parties is going to be. And so if you wanted to overturn or replace an incumbent at any level, the best place to do that in American politics, in most places, is the primary. And it's only astounding if you don't know that incumbents are returned to office at a greater than 90% rate in this country. So the thing that unifies a country that is fractured and certainly polarized is term limits. But the thing that unifies them, but in a way that they don't take responsibility for, is reelecting incumbents. And I think that is a very interesting juxtaposition. That people point to term limits as a way to limit the power of a class of people they're critiquing. However, when given the chance, the people who participate in the process do not seek to displace incumbents in elected offices. I think it's a reasonable conclusion. I think it's a logical conclusion to say the problem in that case is the voters, and that the voters do in fact have power and have been convinced and have further convinced themselves that that is not true, that they do not in fact have power and that their power does not matter. And I think that's wrong. And that's why I wanted to have Samuel Wells back on here. Not just for the voting thing, but in general. People neglecting to notice, people refusing to notice that they have power. And people being determined to acknowledge that they have a passion And I think the term limit / incumbency reelection rate is a really good example of that. People are passionate. I think people are, in this country at least, generally favorable of the current representation that they have. But it's everybody else's representatives that they don't like. And that is a way to abdicate one's responsibility as a citizen. I think this book and the Lenten season, which this episode is not coming out in Lent, but you may be listening to it during Lent, or you may be listening to it on the verge. We may be on the cusp of Lent as you're listening to it. Read this book. I think the idea that resurrection as an example of power and a renewal of creation and the resistance to the powers that this world has to offer, that strong people sitting in places of power will refuse to do things that they are fully empowered to do and claim that they do not have that power. So that's all I have to say on that. Next week on the podcast, William Owens will be talking about his chapter, Literary Constructions and Stereotypes of Slavery. This is the 5th installment of a series of interviews I did on the book Ancient Slavery and Its New Testament Contexts. This was a really good conversation. I think they're all really good conversations. Otherwise, they wouldn't be on my podcast. But I don't know if it's the last that I'll do, but he's the last that I've done so far. And that will also be my 100th episode. Technically, I have released more than 100 episodes, but I don't count episodes where I'm the only one speaking. So at the very least, the 2025 preview and the SBL, the AAR SBL 2023 episode, they don't count. There may be others that I'm not counting too. I'm not sure. But I don't count those. But you can hear this conversation with William Owens now for $5 a month on Patreon. Otherwise, it'll be out next week. So if you get a chance to love someone, whether that's through supporting World Central Kitchen or just telling them that you are their friend and that you are here for them, please do it. Thank you. Take care.
And so, in other words, slave owners all around, Pliny hears he didn't read it in the newspaper. He heard it from friends. Did you hear what happened to the urban praetor Larkius Macedo? And then they describe what happens, how they attacked him in the bath and they pummeled him and they kicked him in his balls. And then they threw him down on the hot floor of the bath, because the floors of a Roman bath it was on sort of like in terms of their design, there was a hot air running between them, so they were warm. And think of a hot beach parking lot, on the black asphalt or something in the summer. They threw him down on the floor and he didn't move because he was unconscious, but he wasn't dead. And then they ran away. And eventually he was revived by what Pliny describes as a number of his more faithful slaves. Well, I think that the journey from part A to point B, where Pliny concludes, and he says, none of us are safe, even those of us like those who are kind masters, but we're surrounded by danger all the time and by nasty looks and insolent gestures and things like that. He scared himself. Going from point A to point B, he imagined the attack on this guy Larkius Macedo, and he realized it could have been me.